William Wallace. Most people know about William Wallace because William Wallace, the fame of him came from Mel Gibson, the movie called Braveheart. And as I've traveled around the country now in 48 states, so many people have seen that movie. So it's a phenomenon, how popular, how successful. You wouldn't think Americans would really like something with Scottish history. But William Wallace and his life is so perfect for America because the man's character is absolutely impeccable. It's flawless and very inspirational. But you know what I discovered as I began to study the life of William Wallace? There's hardly any difference between William Wallace and a man like George Washington or Samuel Adams or Patrick Henry. There were men that were birthed for a time and a purpose, for one desire, and that was to see that liberty under God would be exhibited and shown throughout their land. And for that, he gave his ultimate. He gave up his life. The signers of the Declaration, as you know, of those 56 signers pledged their lives, their honor, and their fortunes. So they pledged everything they had, those 56 signers, many of which did give up their lives through circumstances, through sickness, disease, through hard living, through the things that they lost. They lost their wealth, and their wives, some of the wives died prematurely because of the persecution that came upon them here in this country. So Wallace gave the ultimate. He gave his life, as we'll see as we conclude this message. Let me give you a little bit of background of the Scots. My wife's 100%. I've been over several times. I love Scotland. It's a beautiful country. I've been over to Scotland, England, Ireland, Wales, the entire British Isles. Wonderful place, wonderful history. If you love America, you really love America more when you study it from looking the roots of our country, going back to English and Scottish history. Most Americans who went to government schools, unfortunately, did not get a very good education, so the education of this country is really somewhat narrow and somewhat limited. So as you dig and search a little more, you see that it's not just English history, it's Scottish history. The way I tell people that's so unique, England gave us our love for law, Scotland gave us our love for liberty. You see, England, if they had their druthers, England would have ruled this country strictly by law. Thus, the American Revolution was born. The American Revolution was a protest of Americans who were being bullied by law, sometimes unjust law, quote, taxation without representation, like you have nothing to say, it's our arbitrary rule, we're in charge, we're the king, we tell you what to do, just don't ask questions, do it our way. So England was super law conscious, some good laws and other laws, tyrannical laws. Scotland, on the other hand, which most school books, unfortunately, have left out the entire Scottish history of the making of America and their importance, the Scottish Covenanters, and how they helped in the late 1600s up into the middle 1700s, how 18,000 of them died for their love of liberty, not only of liberty in freedom type of liberty, but also liberty in Christ, to have the liberty to worship the Lord. And how they came to America at the right season, at the right time, just before the American Revolution, and how they inspired our founding fathers with the concepts of liberty. As you know, George III, the King of England, was the king at that time. And these Scottish Covenanters said, hey, as far back as our father and our grandfather, we were fighting for the liberty. You need to resist the tyranny of a king that's unjust. And so thus the American Revolution was born. Little did the kings of England realize when they hurried the Scots out of Scotland and took their land and sent them off to Barbados and the Caribbean and sent them off to this God-forsaken wilderness called America to get rid of those reprobates and those horrible people. Little did they realize that those very people they were ridding themselves of in Britain would come over to America and eventually overthrow the tyranny of England. And that's just how God's laws are. God is so great and so wonderful. So Scotland really should, in your minds, give you an understanding. They gave us the law of liberty. Now, you need to have both. If you have liberty without law, you end up with anarchy. All you end up is with a bunch of kooks running around saying, I'm free, don't tell me what to do. And you'll end up with what you reap is what you sow. You'll end up with a bunch of people that have no control, kind of governless people. Case in point. Remember when the Mayflower came over? They were off course. They were supposed to be in the northern parts of Virginia. They had a contract or a charter from James the First, the King of England, who gave us the King James Bible. Well, that charter was for a certain territory. Well, when the captain, Christopher Jones, said, this is where you're going and you're not going any further, I'm sorry, I don't want to explore for the northern parts of Virginia. It's getting late in the year. This is it. That ended up becoming Plymouth. Well, the charter was void and no effect to Plymouth, so the free English people said, well, great. And it was really the unbelievers or nominal believers, well, we can do what we want now. Without the charter, we can just kind of do our own thing. And they just were deciding to maybe get off the boat and colonize the way they wanted to. But the godly and the wise on that boat, the Christians who understood biblical law, they said, absolutely no way, no how. If you run out there and do your own thing through liberty, you're going to end up causing all kinds of rebellions, all kinds of, we can get picked off in smaller numbers. Let us bind and covenant together, and they actually covenanted and did what was called our first legal document in the country without a king telling us how to draw it up. It was called the Mayflower Compact, and they drew up the Mayflower Compact in the name of God. They established this country in the name of God, knowing that you needed to have just law, biblical law, so that liberty would have its full expression. Well, the Scots taught us that, but it wasn't always so. In those early years, the Scots were wild people. You can't hardly imagine. I can't hardly imagine. I've been to Scotland in the summer. I've been to Scotland where when the clouds come over in the summer and it starts to rain, it gets bitterly cold. It gets approximately a little colder than it is out here in New York right now. In the summertime, it can get between 50 and 60 degrees just because a cloud covers over in the dead of summer in the middle of August. So, therefore, can you imagine these people fighting in the winter? They were so wild and crazy, they fought with no clothes on. What would possess them to do that? I don't know, except they were literally Viking blood. They had Anglo-Saxon blood, Norman blood, Scandinavian. These guys were wild and crazy. They painted their body with tattoos on them. When the Romans came over to conquer Britain, the Romans subjugated all, as you know, Rome took the world, basically. So when they came over to Britain, they go, piece of cake, we'll just take that little flea-bitten island over there. They took England, no problem. When they started to go into Scotland, they found out a problem. They thought, in fact, they called the people wild and crazy. They were terrified of them. These banshees that would be stark naked with tattoos all over their body would go running out there, screaming, just with broadsword weapons, with sticks and shovels and hoes and picks, and just going crazy, Scots, and run out there. Well, the Romans were so terrified of them, they built a wall. That wall is there today, like the Great Wall of China. That wall is called Hadrian's Wall, built about 100 A.D. The wall was basically to keep the crazy people out of England, and so that wall was there, and that wall spans between east to west coast. And it's there as a testimony of the fortitude of these amazing, hardy people. Now, when they weren't fighting the Romans, unfortunately, they were fighting one another. Because they just were kind of like, in their blood, it was like, let's go out and beat somebody up today. And so they're just going out there fighting. They're totally consumed with fighting. So their liberty is to the extent like, well, if anybody steps on my turf, I'll just kill them, kind of liberty. Like, I'll just do whatever I want. So eventually, over a period of time, you ended up with clanism, where you ended up having, for your own protection, family units that had to stay together, bind together, and strengthen communities together so that warring factions would not have the easy prey over the lone ranger kind of farmer out in the back 40 with no protection. And then they ended up getting chiefs, clan chiefs. This would be the guy that was probably the toughest on the block. He could arm wrestle all the men and put them down in a moment or two. He was the strongest of the bunch. They go, here, you're in charge around here, and you'll be our clan chief. So you ended up with chiefs, warlords, you might say, over these different districts throughout the northern regions of the British Isles, which we now know as Scotland. And so eventually, they became civilized through the time and circumstances. I don't have the time right now to give you all those circumstances, but through intermarriage between English and Scottish kings and princesses and princes, they ended up eventually unifying and adapting English law in much of their ways, and keeping their love for liberty. They always had this fierce love for liberty, which England really did not understand, that fierceness, and led to some clashes, which eventually leads to William Wallace. Let me move our time machine to The golden years. The golden years were under Alexander III, the king of Scotland. He was a wonderful king. Alexander III was a great king. A king for approximately 46 years he reigned and ruled in Scotland. And in his time he extended trade, Scottish trade, with England, with Holland, with Norway, with France. And so Scotland was becoming a dot on the map, well known for its wool and its commerce. So he did very well. Unfortunately, it's kind of like one of these Ripley Believe It or Not stories. I just can't hardly imagine how one man could go through so much trauma and turmoil. You know, we think when we have trauma and turmoil, it's bad. This man had it really bad. For example, he had 2 sons. Within 5 years, they both died. So the future heir to the throne of England in the male heir is wiped out. Then he had a daughter. Well, his daughter ends up marrying the Eric of Norway, the Prince of Norway, the king's son, and there's some hope because she produces a daughter by the name of Margaret, which was the name of his wife. His wife was Margaret, by the way. Alexander III's wife was Margaret, but then she dies. So now he's lost his wife and his 2 sons, but his daughter ends up marrying the Prince of Norway, Eric, and produces a daughter, and they named it after the mother's, Margaret. So now little Margaret is born, and everything looks like, well, at least Scotland will have its hope. Meanwhile, he remarries. He remarries a wonderful woman, Jolietta, if my memory serves me correctly, and the marriage is a wonderful marriage. He's very happily married. She's quite young. She's approximately 20 years younger than he is, and he's just enthralled and thrilled. Around 1286, he was going from Edinburgh back to his castle, palace, his home, and on the way on a dark, stormy night, his horse went off a cliff, and he was found dashed to pieces at the bottom of a cliff the following morning. It was a horrible, stormy, terrible Scottish night. He was warned not to go, but he decided to go despite the warnings of his royal court saying, listen, it's too dark at night. He said, no, I want to get home to my wife. I've had enough business in town. Business is over. It's now time to be with my family, or at least with my wife. And so he was killed. So now that left Scotland with only the future potential of a queen, which was his little daughter, who at the time was probably just months old. Well, the hope was pinned on her. To make the story a little shorter, eventually through Edward I, the King of England, they arranged a marriage, or the possibility of a marriage, to the Maid of Norway, little Margaret. They'd called her the Maid of Norway. They were going to arrange the marriage with Margaret and Edward the first son, the future Edward II, and children. Back in those days, it was not unusual to get married at 3 years of age. Could you imagine girls being married at 3 years of age and having your marriage arranged? It doesn't mean you live with the boy. It just means that someday that's your husband, whether you like it or not. Well, it's one of those kind of politically expedient marriages. And to Edward, I'll talk about Edward here for just a moment, because he's very important to speak about. Edward is, to me, one of the most wicked kings in England. And the more I study about Edward, the less I like him. If you read English history, they'll consider him a good king, because basically he was good for England. But when you look at it from the Scottish side, he's a terrible king. He's really a tyrant. One of the things you can do in a nutshell for those of us that are Christians, you can always tell the mark in the heart of a man when you see what he does to the Jewish people. Well, the Jews that were living in England, for the very first time in the English history that we have in recorded English history, he expelled them from the land. So that's going to let you tell you the heart of a man who's very cruel, very vindictive, very evil, very sadistic in much of his ways. They say the only thing civilized about Edward was his wife. His wife had a very strong saving grace influence upon his heart, so whenever he wanted to do something wickedly and dastardly, his wife would discourage him. And so that was a plus and a boon. He had several children. If my memory serves me correctly, I think altogether he fathered approximately 13 to 14 children. So he had a large family. And his wife died thereafter the birth of all those children, and then it became horrible again until he remarried sometime later, if my memory serves me correctly. But during that time that he was without a wife, he became very tyrannical, very revengeful, and very evil. One of his ploys and plans was, you've heard the old expression, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Well, his power as a megalomaniac was to subjugate and take Scotland over. easier said than done. Scotland's not willing to roll over and play dead, even though the golden years are over and the royal king is dead and there's no sons to take the throne. They have their hope in the Maid of Norway. But the devious, wicked, scheming Edward I thought, if I plan the marriage between the future king, my son, Edward II, and the daughter, through the marriage, I'll have dibs on Scotland indirectly through my son. And so you can see his schemes were very deceitful. Well, God had other plans. Unfortunately, how things work and why God does, why he does, how he does it, when he does it, are sometimes a mystery to me. But I do know and I believe in the providence and sovereignty of God. She died. Somehow, some of the reports are she died on the way over to Scotland. We don't know if the ship crashed or she died of fever, but she passed away. That left Scotland without a king or without a queen. Bad news. Edward is probably thinking, good news for me, because maybe I can do it. Well, 13 claimants came to the throne, so 13 said, basically, I can be the king. And everyone said, I'm closer in bloodline to Alexander III than you are. And so there's kind of like, all of them are kind of typical Scots fighting one another to who will be the king of Scotland. The fighting got so fierce among them that they decided they would do, unfortunately, they made the biggest mistake. They would go to Edward and ask him to arbitrate who he would choose to be the future king of England. So with a panel of judges, a panel of people who would study genealogy, you might say, they came up with a fairly good choice. His name was John Baliol. Now, if you look at the bloodline, John Baliol was very close. Closest to him, in some cases, surpassing him as claimant to the throne, was none other than the future king of Scotland, unknown then, was none other than Robert the Bruce, which you will see surface in the movie Braveheart. Very instrumental, very kingpin. Well, Robert the Bruce was set aside for Baliol. Baliol was, as you would imagine, and why Edward probably thought he would be good, he was a puppet king. He didn't start out as a puppet. He did have some gumption to him, but over a period of time, within a year or two, it became obvious that Edward basically said, you either do it my way or you're going to lose all your inheritance. You're going to lose any blessings, anything that we could ever do for you, you will lose. So Baliol basically ceded much of the Scottish rights to Edward I, which made him very egotistically proud, happy, and grateful that now he's somehow controlling Scotland through this little puppet king. The puppet king, for his own good, went over to France and sort of got out of the picture and ruled basically very weakly. So now you have these 12 guys around fighting over who will become the king. Since he's not a very good king, let's get rid of him and get another king. This is in the midst of all this turmoil. Edward is still trying to roll like that steamroller, roll in there and take over Scotland's heritage, Scotland's strength, Scotland's power, and mix it with the throne of England. Well, in the middle of all this, you had dissenters, people who refused to admit that Edward would have any right to Scotland, and thus comes in the life of William Wallace. To start with a man, I like to always start with the family, and I want to start specifically with the father. The father, William Wallace, was one of those men that refused to sign any agreement that would say that I will cede the fact that Edward should probably be, in all practical appearances, the King of Scotland. He refused to sign that decree. See, what Edward began to do is he began to tell all the noblemen, anybody who was anybody, in Scotland to sign a form, basically, pledge allegiance to the throne of England. Well, there were dissenters, and there were few dissenters. Here's the problem. Back in those days, you had classes, and class was big. In America, we can't hardly relate to that because we have a wealthy class, a middle class, and a poor class. But in America, because we're one nation under God and we're sort of indivisible with liberty and justice for all, those class structures somehow merge and mix together because the poor man can vote today as well as a rich man and vote for a candidate of his choice. We can't relate to that in Scotland. The wealthy were always wealthy. The poor were serfs and peasants, and they stay on the land and they have nothing to do. They have lords, and they're basically subservient to their lord. If the lord says, listen, I'm joining that cause, you're coming and fight. Say goodbye to your wife and your children because you may never see them. You come with me because I'm taking everybody off my farm and we're going to go fight for this cause. Well, that feudal serf can't say, well, I don't like the cause. I'll just stay and watch the sheep and take care of potatoes. Absolutely not. You had to go and you had no choice. Well, the ones who had the wealth, he offered them a contract saying, pledge allegiance. If they pledge allegiance, all the common poor peasants, they go with the master. What the master does, they do. Now, what the master, Edward I, was saying is, listen, some of you feudal lords, because over the time in history, you have property in England, don't you? Oh yes, we have a vacation home. We don't go to Colorado. We go to Buckingham Palace, and we go to York, and we have an estate there. Edward said, well, if you want to keep your estate, you better sign this contract, because if you don't put your name on this, you lose your inheritance. You will have no vacation home, because remember, it's in my country called England, and unless you sign, it's out. So some of these guys go, oh, we like our land. We don't want to give it up. Dad, we want to go on vacation this summer, and Dad, please don't sign the contract. And okay, we won't sign the contract. So all these great men, noblemen, who had any clout, were siding with Edward, which was weakening Scotland. They had no backbone. The noblemen and the royalty, the knights and the soldiers, the great men of honor, they were siding with Edward, except for a few, and Wallace was one of the few, his father. Malcolm Wallace was a knight. To be a knight in those days was something. For example, I'm wearing clothing that knights would have had back in those days. And so let me pick up about knights and his father in just a moment, but let me get a little comfortable, break the ice for children, and kind of go over a little bit about the clothing that I have. This is called chain mail. Chain mail was a type of armor that they wore in medieval periods. It wasn't the only kind of thing they wore. They wore sometimes full steel armor, full suits of armor. This is a little bit more mobile type of armor. It's obviously, as crossbows were invented, this would become obsolete. But prior to that, when you do a lot of sword fighting, knife fighting, and that type of fighting, chainmail is very practical. It not only was the shirt that I'm wearing, but it also had some that they put along their legs, and they also maybe had some steel. They would put steel plates along their legs that would come up somewhat under the chainmail. And sometimes they would put steel plates underneath on their forearms that would go underneath the chainmail. So basically, you have a combination of solid plate steel and chainmail. It gets very uncomfortable. Jeremy, would you come up? I'm going to have one of my assistants here in our fellowship tonight be my helper. And I'm going to show you, and I'd rather put this on Jeremy because it's so miserably uncomfortable. I want to make him uncomfortable, not myself. Come over here, Jeremy. Now, this is part of the entire armor. William Wallace would have worn something similar to this, and certainly the soldiers that fought with him would have done that. So, Jeremy, I'm going to put this nice little cute beanie cap on you, and you will look very good. This is to put the chainmail on your head. Now, if you put this chainmail on your head, you would have to have this, because otherwise you're going to end up with the chainmail pinching your hair, and that would be very, very uncomfortable. So, besides, picture Jeremy with this complete outfit on, and then on top of that, he would have this over his head. Oh, how handsome. And he would have this right there, like that. It's great. And so this would be a way of protection. Now, when William Wallace grew up and became wanted, dead or alive, he was on the FBI as the most top 10 wanted English killers at that time, because he hated English. He went to town dressed as I am. This was his bulletproof vest. Now, he didn't wear this vest outwardly, because it would be obviously that you're looking for trouble. Normally you only wore this when you fought. But because he never knew when he would be engaged in battle, he would disguise himself and put his clothing on, this mail on, underneath normal clothing. So Jeremy, take that hat off for just a moment, and I'll put you on some what we would call peasants type clothing, and you can undo this hat too. And I'm going to dress you up as they did back in that period of history. So just kind of slip this over you. Now Wallace, when he went shopping, he basically, underneath this tunic, or this kind of outfit, he would have his chain mail. So you would have the mail underneath this as a disguise. Now, he has to go shopping and act like a normal citizen, so he has to get himself dressed up and still be able to protect himself, because he's not really looking for trouble, but in case he runs into it, he's prepared. Slip that one over your head. This might have been maybe something you'd wear on a little cooler day, when you want to put a little extra clothing on, let's put that belt around your waist there. Sometimes it would not be unusual to put a knife in your belt, on your waist. Okay, just put to punch a couple more holes in there. Sometimes just stick that right here for now. I don't know if it'll hold, but good. And then my favorite part. Wait till you see him dressed in this. He'll look so cool. Where's his head? It's in there somewhere. Now step over here. Now on a cold day, obviously, he would have his hood on, and he has this cute little thing in the back, a little kind of point like that. So, and now you can see how this disguise is great, wouldn't you? Because like underneath here, you would know that he'd have all this chain mail for protection. And this basically is type of the clothing that was worn in medieval period. Armor to peasants' clothing. A peasant man would look basically like Jeremy. It's very simple clothing. By the way, I like the style. I wish it was back in today. This is very, very simple, very, very unique. Jesus of Nazareth basically wore very simple clothing like this. Tunics, like a cloak over the tunic. And so, would you all give Jeremy a hand? Thank you so much. You can take that off out there, off stage with it. Thank you. Now, this I have to explain too before we get into Edward and pick up where I just left off. Back in those days, I mean, to the boys, you would love it, is PE in those days was sword fighting. I mean, you had no choice. It's like, I had one mother, after hearing this talk about Little Bear, it sounds so violent. It's like, you mean, didn't he just play soccer or basketball or anything like that? Absolutely not. Their entire time was devoted to sparring with sticks when they were 5 or 6 years old with their neighborhood boys and pretending they're knights in shining armor, fighting for the cause of liberty, family, friends, and they go out there and they sword fight and they just hack. Actually, when they got older, they actually sword fought with real swords. Mommy, I need stitches. I just cut my finger off, you know. I said, well, son, that's good. Get tough, you know. I mean, these guys are, we can't even relate to it because it's so foreign to our thinking. They're literally, the boys are groomed to be warriors. They have to be. Peasants have to fight. I mean, they're learning as children because those peasants, whether like or not, are inducted into the military service. I mean, you are major drafted, no choice. You go and you fight. So fighting was the rule of the day, a sad plight for difficult, dangerous, and hard to live days. Well, fortunately, I went to Scotland this last summer, a month, August, a year ago. This is now September. August, last month, a year ago, we were in Scotland. This is the first time after all those years I finally got to go, and I wanted to go. I drove by it many times, but I finally got to go. It was called Wallace Monument, built during the Victorian period, late 1800s, early 1900s. Great monument to the life of William Wallace. It's basically a museum. And you walk up these narrow, winding staircases, and it takes you to where his great battle took place, right out in front of Stirling Bridge, right out by the Stirling Castle. And in there, about the second floor up, there's kind of a landing. You can walk in there, look at pictures and charts, and listen to some video presentations. There's a big glass case with the sword of William Wallace. Well, I stopped, and fortunately, I was very blessed to have a man who was a BBC historian on location that summer describing all the weapons of that time. And he began to describe all the weapons of Wallace and all the fighting weapons of the time. And the sword of William Wallace, the one I have here, is puny. I mean, this is a small version that I can take on the airplane, on the trunk, kind of like, you know, taking cargo. His sword goes from right here, the bottom of the ground, all the way up to about right here. That's just the blade. The handle goes all the way up to here. His sword was approximately 6 foot long. The sword did not go on the side as I just had. The sword went over the back. Because it's so long, it would drag on the ground. So you just lift it up over your head in a special holster that held the sword around your chest. This sword is quite light, probably only weighs about 1.5 pounds to 2 pounds. I asked the museum curator, this BBC expert on military medieval history, to tell me about the weapons. And he began to describe battle axes, this, that, and then he began to describe Wallace's sword. It's called a claymore. I have one at home. It's too big to bring with me. It's a solid steel sword that looks like a cross, a T. It's a T-post. Handle, foot-long handle with a cross, a hilt. The blade is a hilt. Excuse me, the hilt is a part that protects your hand, which is the cross part, with this long 5-foot length steel. Now he had an unusual weapon there. It looked like a weapon to me. It was a pipe with a chain ball on it. And I asked him, "Is that one of those things you swing?" He goes, "Oh no. This is to give you an idea of how heavy Wallace's sword is." Well, being a tourist, I thought, well, maybe I could ask you if I could hold it. I said, "Can I hold it?" He goes, "Well, that's what it's for." Most of the other tourists, it's kind of fun to be around tourists because you have two types. You have the type that don't ask anything because they're too embarrassed and they're afraid they'll ask the wrong question. And you have the kind like me that ask too many questions, that ask dumb questions. So I said, "Well, can I hold that pipe?" "Yes, you can." And so he said, now he picked it up and he says, now stand sideways, hold your shoulders square, hold your arms tight. And I'm thinking to myself, just let go of the pipe. You're not talking to a wimp. I work out with weights. I'm in good health. I can hold a pipe, big deal. But I'm being polite. I'm going, "Yes, it's just okay, like this, yes." I'm being a polite tourist and talking like that. "Yes, okay, hold it like that, yeah." He says, "Now you ready?" "Yes, I'm ready." "Are you sure you're holding yourself strong?" "I'm going to let go of it." "Are you ready?" I'm going, "Yeah, I'm very ready. I'm as ready as I'll ever be." And so he let go of it, and as he let go of it, the point dipped down. I am thankful he coached me. Because had he let go of it, I would have dropped it out of my hand. The pipe weighed 50 to 60 pounds. He said, "That's the weight of William Wallace's sword." I go, "You're joking." He goes, "Absolutely not." I said, so I asked him a very good question. You probably would ask him the same question. I go, "But why would you have a pipe that would give me the weight with a ball and a chain on it?" He goes, "That's to give you the idea of how it was weighted. It's like a T," he says, like a golf club wood. The thin shank, somewhat stouter handle with a heavy wood on the end, so that when you swing the wood, it hits the ball and drives that ball a longer distance than your regular iron does. He said that's how the sword's designed. It's designed so the energy that it takes to lift, once it starts swinging, it cuts heads off very easily. And he said, that's the way it was made. He said the sword is made so that you just keep swinging, you don't stop, you let the momentum keep going, and that gives you an idea of what the battles were like. Well, Wallace's father, where he learned all this, was a knight. To become a knight, he was somebody. You don't just become a knight because they like you. It's a personality thing. I vote you Knight of the Year. Absolutely not. Knight means that you did some daring feat, some incredible feat, that you get knighted by the king. Well, he was knighted. Malcolm Wallace was a knight, and he refused to submit to Edward I. For this, he was killed in a battle called the Battle of Loudon Hill with a bunch of his friends that were also liberty and freedom fighters. They refused to sign. They were ganged up by the English. His father was such a fierce fighter. The English, knowing they had no power over him, they cut the back of his legs, they cut the back of his knee, they hamstrung him where he fell to his knees, and in his death, fighting off the English on his knees, he killed a multitude. It took so many English ganging up on him that he couldn't swing his sword fast enough, and he died. Wallace at the time was 19 years of age, and he was in Bible school. This is one thing the movie does not bring out about William Wallace that I personally like. So I went back to a book, and I will read to you the character of William Wallace. Mel Gibson cannot fully depict what William Wallace was like from all outward appearance. William Wallace is probably 6'7" to 7'2". Anybody who has a 6-foot sword is not 5'4". Most of the Scots in those days were between 4'8" and 5'2". You were tall if you're 5'8". He's probably 6'7" to 7'2". He's a giant of a man. He's huge. He has to be to have the strength to wield that sword and have the length of that sword. I got to have the opportunity to introduce our basketball Spurs player, David Robinson, at a National Homeschool Basketball Conference where I was the Master of Ceremony. And he's approximately 7'2", if my memory serves me correctly, and I'm 5'9". I don't know if you've ever talked to somebody that's into their 7 feet. And you're literally looking straight up. I mean, if you talk for any length of time, your neck gets tweaked. And it's very intimidating. And then I suppose if he talks any length of time, his neck gets tweaked because he's looking down the entire time. I mean, literally, he's looking straight down, and I'm not just glancing up, I'm looking straight up. I mean, it's so hard to fathom, because normally we don't deal with people like that. William Wallace was that type of person. To the average Scots, he was a huge giant. What always gets me is kind of humorous. How does he sneak around town in a disguised costume, towering 4 foot taller than the average person? I don't know that part. 3 to 4 foot taller. But the books tell me he had a disguise of some kind, and he wore his armor underneath him. You'd think just by the height, there he is, that's got to be him. Forget what he's wearing, it's just him. So he was big. Now I will give you a description of a man. See, after William Wallace died, a priest who knew Wallace personally wrote his life story in Latin. That life story was translated, and it became an English poem, epic poem by a man named Blind Harry. And so some of the stories of Wallace, because he's half legend and half real, they get like Davy Crockett killed a bear when he was only 3. It's called Tall Tale. So I have to kind of weed through all this to end up with a very accurate, descriptive story of William Wallace. Here is a very accurate description of his character, his type of personality that he was, and I love it. He was courageous, active, spirited, affectionate. By the way, this report I'm giving you was from a man who personally knew him, and the report came to the author who interviewed the man, so you're getting a very accurate description. Affectionate towards his fellows, yet able to keep discipline. He was calm, intrepid, full of wisdom and self-discipline. I love this part. He was a lover of the Word of God, and he placed his affections in his favorite book, the Book of Psalms. Now, I can really relate to Wallace. The nearest thing biblically to Wallace is the same as David. King David was a mighty man of valor, and he loved the Word of God, and he wrote and penned the Psalms. So there's a tender heart, there's a tender part of David that's very precious, very tender when you read the Psalms. There's another part that cuts giants' heads off, and that's the ignominy of David. Mighty warrior, strong man, mighty tender man that collects tears in a bottle because of his heart towards God. You have a little description of William Wallace in the life of King David. He was a tall man with the body of a giant, cheerful in appearance, agreeable in features, broad-shouldered, big-boned, a belly in proportion with his lengthy flanks, pleasing in appearance, but with a wild look. I thought that was real interesting. Broad in the hips, strong in the arms, legs, and he was a most spirited fighting man. All his limbs were very strong and firm. Moreover, the Most High distinguished him distinguished him and his changing features with a certain good humor. He had so blessed his words and deeds with a certain heavenly gift that by appearance alone he won over to himself the grace and favor of the hearts of all loyal Scots. Now what he's really winning over are the peasants. The noble people who are siding with England, the two-faced, the kind of sell out for anything. Don't take my land, I'll sell out, I'll sign the contract. They're not really crazy about Wallace. The common people love Wallace. He's a man for the common people. It's not surprising, for he was most liberal with his gifts. He was fair in judgments, most compassionate. He comforted the sad. He was a most skilled counselor. He was patient when suffering, a distinguished speaker who above all hunted down falsehood and deceit. He detested treachery, and for this reason the Lord was with him and helped him. He was a man successful in everything, and a veneration for the church and a respect for the clergy. In fact, he was in Bible school to study for the clergy because his uncle was a clergyman. Now remember, back in those days you have no Protestant churches, you only have the Roman Catholic Church. And so he's studying for the ministry in the Roman Catholic Church. A veneration for the church and clergy. He helped the poor, the widows. He worked for the restoration of wards, orphans, and he brought relief to the oppressed. He laid in wait for thieves, robbers, and inflicted vigorous justice on them without any sense of reward. Because God was greatly pleased with his works of justice of this kind, in consequences he guided all his activities. That gives a brief description of the William Wallace. Well, with his father dead, he left the ministry because he had to take care of his mother, and he still had an older brother. And so between his brothers, to have to take care of his mother, and I believe he had even a younger sister, he has to flee for his life. Now that the father wouldn't sign, and the father's a rebel rouser, you might as well go after the children because you want to stomp out any bloodline that has to do with anybody that will resist Edward. Sort of like when Jesus of Nazareth comes along, you got these Herod guys going around killing anybody who's related to anything. Kill all the children just to be safe. Kill them, kill them, kill them. And so you have this kind of royal edict, like kill all the Wallace clan. If the fathers, the children might be against it, just to be safe. So basically, they now have to live as fugitives, and they're kind of living in caves, and they're living with relatives, and they're living wherever they can live. And Wallace is trying to make an ends meet to help his family. In the midst of all this, he gets married. He marries a woman named Marion Beaufort. She's French descent. Wonderful marriage. In the movie Braveheart, they show the marriage clandestine, hidden in the back. No one knows. It's not like, I'm going to church, get married Sunday. Everybody's welcome to see my marriage. I'll tell you why this was done secretly. And there's some good cause to this, and there is some legitimacy to what I'm about to tell you. Edward was so devious, he thought eventually he could break the backs of Scotland by intermarrying them with the English. Because if you have half-breeds, half English, half Scots, they won't be so hostile against England because I'll kind of mix their bloodline and strip away from their kind of fierce Scottish independent spirit because they'll be half English. Here was his devious plan. They would do what was called first night. They would go to a church where there was everyone come to my wedding kind of ceremony, and soldiers would walk in, and after the priest said, I now pronounce you husband and wife, go off and celebrate your marriage, an Englishman would come up and take the wife of the man and cohabit with her for at least 1 week with the hopes of producing offspring that would be half English, half Scotland. So the first birth would be given over to Edward. The first fruits would be given over to Edward I. Needless to say, it doesn't make men very happy. And so these men are fit to be tied. So when a guy like Wallace comes around, you can see why they're joining Wallace. On top of that, in the movie, based on what I see in history, it's not unlikely that his wife was killed. The movie has her throat slit. She's aiding and abetting a fugitive, William Wallace, and for that she's killed. Wallace goes berserk. I mean, you've just killed the father, first nights, now you kill my wife. I mean, this guy, he is like, ugh, English, they're destroying our land. And he has something that I can't slight them for. He's obsessed with driving the English out of Scotland. And for this, he begins he turns all his energies into becoming a freedom fighter. And he begins to grab a rabble. He sort of became like David with his mighty men of valor. They went to the caves. And when Saul of Tarsus when King David's father, Saul, was after David to kill David, David hid from the royal king. And in the midst of that, he had the scourge of the earth follow him. You're looking at a Wallace story there too. The king wants to kill Wallace and all the English, so the scourge of the earth come and follow Wallace, and he gets such a large band that the noblemen who are siding with Edward are getting concerned. And it leads to several battles. Wallace eventually gets in some battles that he is such a fierce fighter. Single-handedly, in some reports, he killed in some battles probably 30 to 40 people single-handedly within a perimeter of a small area, just hacking and whacking. You just imagine the horrible blood that would be spilled in fighting for Scottish liberty. At the Battle of Stirling Bridge, Edward brings his mighty armada. He brings the strongest, the most fit. He takes his two greatest generals, he puts them and pitches them against these weak, fledgling Scots who barely have any weapons, who have hardly any horses, hardly any full body armor because you can't afford full body armor, and he pitches them in a battle called the Battle of Stirling Bridge. Miraculously, odds totally against Wallace. Wallace soundly defeats the two greatest generals that England had and defeats English army soundly. Edward was not there at that battle. I believe he was in Flanders, taking care of some businesses in Flanders. When Edward hears that Wallace, the Scots rebel rouser, this freedom fighter, this to the English, this good-for-nothing scum of the earth, this bum, who's got no titles, no name, no land, no nobody, he's fit to be tied. He musters an army that's so huge and so enormous, and Wallace at this time, he became such a popular figure, they basically made him the governor of Scotland. They made him, since you're not going to have a king, we'll make you next in line. You are in charge of Scotland. He kind of is like what Cromwell was when he defeated Charles I. He became the Lord Protector of England. Scotland has now William Wallace. He is the talk of the town all over. He is the George Washington of Scotland. I mean, he is somebody. He musters a large army. The noblemen reluctantly, jealously say, well, we like you, but behind the scenes we can't stand you. We're jealous. I wish we had what you had, but you. And so, but we got to go along with you. We got to smile and act like we like you, because all the people who follow you work for us on our plantation. And if we say we don't like you, they won't till the ground this year. And so we need them. So we're going to try to pretend we like you. So at the Battle of Falkirk, they all lined up. The nobleman says, don't worry, we're with you. Just get out there. When the battle starts, we'll join forces. They had the horses, they had the armor, they had the clout, they had the money, they had it all. Wallace sends his field infantry out, and he came up with some amazing battle tactics that were so great in battle. And in the midst of the battle, Wallace was holding his own. However, there was a secret weapon that Edward came up with, unknown to most military history at that time. From that time over, it became more and more popular. The Welshmen were longbow archers, and they began to shower arrows from a distance. The thing that's amazing about archery, you don't even have to be involved in the battle. You just go like this, and how can you miss? You have 10,000 out there, just shoot up. You're bound to hit something over there. And so arrows are just raining down on all these men. These Scots are being decimated. Well, Wallace, seeing the problem with the secret weapon and how it's going against him, comes up with his plan. He tells all the noblemen, send your troops in there, take the troops, attack them now. That's the weakness of archery. Since you're not clothed in armor, when you have the infantry come in on you, or you have the cavalry come in on the horses, man, they can decimate. You just hack you to pieces with swords and you're dead. So when he called the secret weapon, Wallace's great weapon, the cavalry to charge the archers, they looked at the situation. They didn't really like Wallace. They were somewhat jealous of him. They saw that if they left, Wallace would probably be killed and defeated, which is good. Good riddance to bad rubbish. And so they decided they would just go off the battlefield. In the movie Braveheart, it's a very poignant part of the movie. Wallace looks up and sees the last card, the only hope he has to save his... I mean, you're talking about men who die for a cause. These guys aren't in it for money. They have nothing. They're in it for their life. And when he sees them being forsaken, he just goes crazy like, you're leaving the field. He just overwhelmed. He just, basically, in the movie, it doesn't quite show it, but in the history book, he's forced off the battlefield. He's the crowning glory of Scotland. He's forced off the battlefield, and somehow he has an involvement with the future king of England, Robert the Bruce. And in this encounter, in the movie, they show it as Robert the Bruce about ready to kill Wallace, and he doesn't realize it's Wallace, and when he sees it's Wallace, Robert the Bruce is cut to the quick. But in one of the reports that I read of the life of Wallace, he looks at Robert the Bruce, he goes, you are a woman. You could have been standing for Scotland, but you're not. You have gone over to England, and you have hauled the King of England as the Lord of Scotland. He is no Lord. You will never become a great man until you have the cause of the Scottish blood in you and you stand for the liberty. You are a traitor to Scotland, you are. And Robert the Bruce later said it so pierced his heart. It so grieved him. Because what he was double-minded and unstable in all his ways. He was those guys vacillating. I like Edward for its convenience, but I like Scotland too. And I want Scotland to like me. But I want Edward to like me because Edward gives me money and gives me title and gives me position. And he's just this, it's sickening. It's like, ugh. It's like no backbone, doesn't stand for something. It reminds you of modern politicians today. They'll go to one group and they'll go, vote for me for this cause. They'll turn around to the other group, vote for me for this. There's a totally opposite cause. I mean, out of the same mouth, they're just two-faced like a bunch of hypocrites, and you get sick of people with no backbone like that. And so Wallace had the backbone. He was so soundly defeated. He basically lost, he turned over his guardianship. He said, listen, you guys don't even want me around here no more. And so he went over to France to muster up the Pope, to muster up French sympathies, to somehow build another band that would, through political pressure, put pressure on Edward to back off and leave Scotland alone. Well, he comes back to comes back to Scotland after about a year and a half. He musters up another band, but it never gets off very well. He ends up doing guerrilla warfare, and that at this point, while he was gone to France, the tragedy of the story was that William Wallace had to, while he was gone, the most loyal followers of his signed a waiver, sort of like the king said, listen, you used to fight with Wallace, let bygones be bygones. If you sign this decree and side with me, we'll live happily ever after. And we'll just forget that you actually took the sword against the king at Stirling Bridge, at Falkirk. And so these guys, even the bishops and some of these most loyal, faithful friends, says, okay, I'll sign, everything's fine. When Wallace comes back, he goes, what did you do? I lived over the country to help you, and you just have to turn over the country to the English? This is what's the matter? Don't you have to have backbone? You're doing what the others have done. How could you do this? It's kind of like the guy that stands alone. But always in the midst, you always have somebody. Jesus had Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, had 11. Judas betrayed him. But he always had those faithful 3 that were even the strongest, that were there at the garden. But even at the garden, he says, well, you too fall asleep. Could you not stay and watch with me for 1 hour? Well, Wallace fell asleep in a barn, in a farmhouse kind of thing, just outside of Glasgow. He had his best friend, I believe his name was Douglas, if my memory serves me correct. But the man was staying downstairs, at the foot of the stairs, guarding his loyal master above. Well, it was pitch dark at night. He fell asleep. And Wallace was betrayed by a traitor, sort of like Judas Iscariot. He was a man by the name of Menteith. The Menteith was a royal family line, a noble family line, had clout. And Menteith was a friend of Wallace's. So Menteith gave him 30 pieces of silver, so to speak, to betray Wallace, and since he knew where Wallace was, none of the people suspected him coming to Wallace, and he took a band of English soldiers by night, and he had the soldiers kill his bodyguard downstairs, his most faithful and loyal friend, and then he went upstairs and had the squire, the page boy, the squire boy that Wallace was familiar with, who was in on this betraying, take his swords and knives and whatever weapons he had, take them from him, so when the soldiers kill his buddy, go upstairs and capture him, he can't defend himself. Sure enough, they went upstairs, they began to grab the body. Wallace just woke up from a dead sleep and started swinging. He's reaching for his weapons, he can't find them, and in the midst of swinging for his weapons, the guy's so powerful, he ends up cracking the skull of one guy with his fist. He hits him so hard, he cracks the skull open with a fist. He's throwing bodies all over the room. He's going to kill these guys single-handedly. He's like a lion in a cage. And so Menteith, who hears this down below, realizes that his buddies are going to be killed, that are capturing Wallace. He goes, it's no use, you have to surrender. The whole place is surrounded. It was a lie. When Wallace came down, trusted the voice of his friend, there was no one there. They took him to England, they tied him, they dragged him behind a horse, they made a mockery of a trial. It's a very, very tragic part of his life. And they gave him an opportunity at the trial to sign a form that would say, cede your loyalty to Edward and all let bygones be bygones. He said he would not. In fact, in the trial that he said he did murders, he killed, they listed a whole arm of grievances, which were all true. But then when they said, and Edward, you refuse to acknowledge as your king, it's treason. He was like Jesus, a lamb before his shears. He never spoke until that. He was such a man of character and principle. He did not want it written down for future posterity to hear that in the minutes, in the court report. The court report is that it's treason to refuse the King of England. He spoke up. That's the only time he spoke in his trial at his defense. He said, I want it known in the record. It is not treason. I hold that John Baliol is the king, the rightful king of Scotland. It is not Edward. He is not a king. It cannot be treason. Treason is denying the king. If he's not the rightful king, then it's not treason. I want you to know that all that you have said is the truth. But it is not the truth that it is treason for which I have done these things. I have done it for the loyalty and the liberty of Scotland, and that may be reported. Well, that didn't go over very well with Edward. They took him to the gallows, and they did something to Wallace that they had done to no other man in the history of torture. And that was the beginning of what you would do from future generations forward to anyone who would resist the king. The first thing they did is they stripped off his clothes. Everybody laughed at him. They tied him behind a horse, and they dragged him all over the streets of London for a while. They took him up the scaffold, put a rope around his neck, and they dropped him through the hole. And they did the rope in such a way where it wouldn't kill him, but would tweak him. I talked about major whiplash. Then they brought him back on there, and they asked him if he'd sign. He refused to sign. And then they stretched his body, and they put it at about a 40-degree angle so the entire group could see him in the crowd, and they stretched his body. And then tragically, the sad part about it, and I have to say this in a discreet way, but we as adults would understand, it's a tragedy, is they took his manhood from him. And there in the midst of all those people, he lost his maleness. And you can imagine this great warrior of Scotland standing up there, could have relented, but he refused to. And then on top of that, the next thing they did, they took a knife and they cut up his belly and they took out his guts and his innards. They took out his intestines and his stomach and they threw him in a fire and burned him there. He's still alive. There's no surgery, there's no medication, nothing. And they ripped out his insides. That was the punishment for what he had done to the Catholic Church in England. As the Catholics moved in there, he part of the rabble they roused out of Scotland were these English priests. And so for that, the punishment of the church was to torture and burn Wallace by burning his innards. And the very last thing that they did is they grabbed his heart and they held his heart up. Of course, by that time he's obviously died. They grabbed his heart up, and in the movie it's so poignant. The last thing out of his mouth was, "Freedom!" And he sailed into eternity. What an incredible story. Well, you think it was all over, and Edward says, good riddance to bad rubbish. That year was around 1297, if I remember right. I'll give you the exact date, just because I like to be accurate. That was the year of, I don't want to take too much time, 1305, August 22nd, called Black Wednesday. He was executed in Scotland, in England. They amputated his body, cut him into 4 pieces, cut off his head, took his torso, put him throughout all the provinces of Scotland as a warning to all the Scots, do not follow the way of William Wallace. It backfired. Because what it did is it roused up the spirit of liberty. And these people realized you can kill the man, but you'll never kill the liberty. And they started standing for those convictions. And those convictions became so strong that by 1307, Robert the Bruce came to the throne. And Robert the Bruce did a little bit like Sam Houston did with the death of Travis, Crockett, and Bowie and 186 Texans at the Alamo. He basically said when he went after Santa Anna, because Santa Anna was the same spirit of Edward I, a tyrant taking the liberties from people. And in Houston, when he saw the Mexicans all trapped on a little island in San Jacinto, he burnt the bridge down. He gathered his Texans. He said, I want you men to remember the Alamo. I want you to remember Goliad. And I want you to go out there and stand for these principles. We're fighting. He says, I burnt the bridge. I want you, all you men. He says, we're going to do or die. We're going to die here for liberty. That was the spirit that these men had. Robert the Bruce presented to the king the Declaration of Arbroath, and I'll close with this. As long as 100 of us shall remain alive, we shall never in any wise consent to submit to the rule of the English or any other usurper of God's law. It is not for glory that we fight, nor for riches, but for honor and for freedom. That freedom alone. That freedom which no good man loses but with his life. This freedom is yielded to us by the crowned right of kings, the Lord King Jesus. And these men understood that liberty came as a gift of God. So Wallace, to have that conviction, had to have 2 things that I want to leave you with. He had to have a conviction that was an absolute right and there's an absolute wrong, and I will die for that absolute right. He refused to submit. And he had to have a physical strength. So he had physical strength and he had spiritual strength, an inward and an outward strength that made him a mighty man. He basically was clothed with the full armor of God. He was clothed with an entire armor that strengthened him and made him the great hero, the great man that helped Scotland achieve its liberty. May we teach these principles to our children so that they will be able to take these and defend for this country of America. More now than ever do we need our children to stand for convictions of absolute rights when we have so much gray, so much political correctness, so much lies and deception from our senates and from our House and from our judicial system. It's time that we as families may determine that we will teach our children As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord, and we will stand for truth, for convictions, for honesty, for justice. Even so, yea, Lord, it may be that it would cost the lives of our very children in the near future. I believe America could even come to the point where we'll persecute the Christians who stand for those principles. And that's the kind of people we want to be clothed with the armor of God to stand in the day of battle. Let's pray. Father in heaven, may we stand for convictions, truth, justice, honor, commitment, Lord, not compromising, not the politically expediently correct way, Lord, not getting in a situation where the House or Senate will compromise and allow bills to go through that are totally weak and ineffective and inefficient, Lord, showing the spineless backbone that these men have. They fear the media and their job security more than what they have as convictions in their heart. Father, may our children not see us as parents slack in firmness, truth, and what is right. May our children learn to grow up and to be strong. For my own son, Joshua, Lord, may he be a mighty man of valor, a mighty warrior that will stand for convictions. For my daughters to raise children thereafter with these same principles that their father has exhibited. Father, I thank you for these children that are here and these families, and we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.